The colonel pointed at her like she was furniture. "You, nurse, get my bags to the East Wing." He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. Colonel Adrian Voss had spent 26 years in uniform collecting deference the way other men collected commendations, and the woman standing in the gray coat at the entrance of Northbridge Military Medical Center looked like exactly the kind of person who carried things for other people. She was calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for his bags. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, turned, and walked away. Voss stared at her back with his jaw tight. He had no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his career. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Colonel Adrian Voss arrived at Northbridge Military Medical Center, it was the kind of cold that came through walls. The facility sat at the edge of a former industrial corridor in Valderton, a mid-sized city that had spent 2 decades pretending its best years weren't behind it. The base attached to the medical center was one of the older installations in the regional command structure. Not glamorous, not strategically critical in the way command liked to advertise, but essential in the ways that only became obvious when things went wrong. Voss didn't particularly care about essential. He cared about performance, about visible order, about the impression a unit made when command walked through the door. He'd built his reputation on inspections that went well, on numbers that lined up, on subordinates who understood which answer to give when a senior officer asked a question. I was thorough in the way that rewarded thoroughness only when it produced acceptable results. The rest he smoothed over. He arrived with a detail of 3. His aide, Captain Marcus Felder, who had spent 3 years learning to anticipate which direction Voss's irritation would travel next. A logistics officer named Strand, and a communications specialist who was mostly there to make the group look larger than it was. They came in 2 vehicles, and Voss stepped out onto the concrete entrance apron, already holding his travel case at arm's length, already scanning for someone to hand it to. The woman in the gray coat was standing near the entrance checkpoint, studying something on a clipboard. She wasn't in any uniform he recognized. The coat was plain, military cut, but unadorned, the kind worn by field medical staff or base contractors, or any of the dozen categories of personnel who move through a facility like this without drawing much attention. She had the stillness of someone who had learned to be unobtrusive in crowded rooms. Voss barely registered her as a person before his mouth was already moving. "You, nurse." He held the travel case slightly higher, a gesture so automatic it had no real thought behind it. "Get my bags to the East Wing, Colonel Voss's inspection detail." She looked up from the clipboard. The look wasn't startled, wasn't searching, wasn't deferential. It lasted exactly as long as it took her to understand what he'd said, and then she turned and walked through the entrance doors without a word. Voss stood holding his own bag. Felder appeared at his elbow half a second later, took the case with the practiced smoothness of a man who had absorbed embarrassment on his superior's behalf many times before. "I'll get it squared away, sir." Voss watched the entrance doors settle shut. "Who was that?" "I'm not certain, sir. I can find out." "Don't bother." Voss straightened his jacket and moved toward the doors. "Whoever she is, she'll be back on base assignment by the end of the week." He walked inside, believing that. He had no particular reason not to. Elena Vera had been at Northbridge for 4 days before Voss arrived, and in those 4 days she had moved through almost every functional section of the facility without anyone looking at her twice. That was, in itself, a finding. She had spent the better part of 30 years learning that rank was a useful tool, but a poor diagnostic instrument. Rank told you what people performed when they knew they were being evaluated. The plain gray coat told her what they did when they thought no one important was watching. She'd used variations of this approach at 6 other facilities in the last 4 years, and the pattern held with depressing consistency. The further from visibility a unit operated, the more honestly it functioned, for good or for bad. At Northbridge, the nursing and medical staff on the overnight floors were running on short rotations and lateral problem-solving that would have impressed her even under ideal conditions. They were covering gaps with improvisation, and they knew they were covering gaps, and they'd stopped reporting the gaps through official channels because the official channels had spent 18 months producing nothing but confirmation emails and no material change. The supply storage was where Elena had spent most of her time. The Eastern Supply Corridor ran behind the primary treatment wards. and it was climate-controlled in a way that suggested it had once held temperature-sensitive materials before budget adjustments shifted those materials elsewhere. What it held now was a documented inventory of emergency trauma kits, 340 units listed as available in the readiness report submitted to Regional Command 6 weeks ago. And what it actually contained was significantly less than that. She'd counted herself 3 times, on 3 different mornings, at different hours, with a shift supervisor named Ortega, who didn't know who she was and had spent most of the first morning trying to be helpful, and the second morning visibly nervous, and the third morning just quiet and careful, because he was a smart man, and he'd started to understand that whoever this woman was, she was counting things that had not been counted carefully in a long time. "Walk me through the transfer logs," she'd told him that third morning. Ortega had pulled up the records on a battered terminal near the corridor entrance. He had the posture of someone who'd been standing on something uncomfortable for a long time and had gotten so used to it he'd stopped noticing. Transfers went through central logistics. Any discrepancy between the count and the report would have been flagged through Captain Harwick's office. Was it flagged? A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it needed to. "I filed a discrepancy notice in September. And I was told the count was a reconciliation issue, that the transfers had been processed under a consolidated code and the inventory would update in the next cycle." "Did it update?" Ortega looked at the screen. The report shows 340 units. Elena looked at the shelf in front of her. "How many are actually here?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited him out. 112, he said. 114 if 2 kits in the back are still serviceable. I haven't opened them. She wrote nothing down. She hadn't written anything down in front of any of the staff she'd spoken with. Everything went to the secure recorder she wore clipped to the inside of the coat's left breast pocket, and everything that went there would eventually go into a report that would carry more institutional weight than anything she'd produced at a desk. "How long have you known the number was wrong?" she asked. Ortega was quiet for a moment. "Since March." It was November. She thanked him and walked back toward the main building, and that was when Voss's car had been pulling up outside and she'd been standing near the checkpoint reading through a facilities maintenance log, and Voss had done what Voss had apparently spent 2.5 decades doing without consequence. She'd looked at him. She'd done the math in about 1.5 seconds, and she'd walked inside. The inspection briefing was scheduled for 1400 hours in the second-floor conference suite, which had windows that looked out onto the parking structure and a smell of industrial carpet that no amount of heating could fully neutralize. Elena sat in the back row. She'd done that on purpose, too. She wanted to watch the room before the room watched her. Colonel Voss entered at 13:58 with Felder behind him, carrying 2 folders and a tablet, and the assembled staff, department heads, unit supervisors, the facility's own commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Deanna Price, stood with the kind of automatic snap that indicated Voss had been here before and had made the expectations clear on previous visits. Price was a lean woman with iron-gray hair cut to regulation and the face of someone who had learned to present one expression regardless of what was happening underneath it. She'd been at Northbridge for 7 years and had twice been passed over for the kind of advancement that should have followed her service record. Elena knew this because she had read Price's file very carefully before she'd gotten on the plane to Valderton. She also knew that Price had co-signed the readiness report containing the 340-unit inventory count. Whether that made Price complicit or cornered was a question Elena didn't yet have a full answer to. "Gentlemen, thank you for assembling," Voss said, as though thanking them were a formality rather than a sentiment. He set his own folder open on the table and moved to the front of the room with the ease of someone who'd given this particular performance enough times to stop thinking about it. "I'm going to move through the departmental readiness summary first. Then we'll take questions in the appropriate sequence. I've reviewed the preliminary submissions, and the numbers look solid." He paused, scanning the room in the way senior officers sometimes did to register who was paying attention and who might need to be reminded about that later. His eyes moved across the back row without stopping. "Let's get into it." Elena listened. Voss moved through the readiness sections with practiced efficiency. Medical staffing, fully compliant. Equipment maintenance, on schedule. Supply readiness, excellent, with the trauma kit inventory showing a slight improvement over the previous quarter's already strong performance. He said the last part without inflection. So did Price, when Voss asked her to confirm the supply numbers. 340 trauma kits fully stocked and available, Price said. The room recorded this without reaction. A lieutenant in the second row was taking notes. Strand, the logistics officer from Voss's detail, had his tablet open and was populating a template. Elena wrote nothing. She listened to Price say the number, and she watched Price's face while she said it, and she noted that Price did not look at anyone else in the room while she said it, which was either composure or containment, and either way was worth knowing. After the briefing, Voss held a narrow, informal review in the hallway with Price and two of her department heads. Elena passed them on her way to the East Wing. She stopped at the supply corridor one more time, not to count again, but to make sure the recorder had picked up Ortega's voice cleanly the previous morning. It had. She checked 3 other audio captures from the week. A conversation with a medic named Callahan who described being told to re-sign an equipment verification sheet he hadn't personally checked. A 10-minute exchange with a supply tech named Robles who had started crying halfway through and then apologized and then kept talking anyway. And a brief exchange with a physician's assistant who'd asked Elena, with genuine uncertainty, whether she was there to fix things or just document them. Elena had told her she was there to understand the situation fully before determining the appropriate response. The PA had said, quietly, "Because it's been like this for 2 years, and people are tired." Elena had said she understood. She did understand. She also understood that understanding the situation and having the authority to do something about it were 2 different things, and she hadn't yet introduced herself to anyone in this building in any official capacity, and there was a reason for that. That reason presented itself 2 hours later in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. She was in the corridor outside the primary ER intake when Voss found her. He'd been looking for her, not because he'd identified her, but because something about the morning's encounter had apparently settled into an irritation he hadn't discharged. He had Felder with him, and when he spotted the gray coat ahead of him in the corridor, his pace changed. "Hold on." She turned. Voss covered the remaining 10 feet with the stride of someone accustomed to having people wait for him and not particularly interested in changing that. He looked at her the way men like Voss sometimes looked at people they'd decided were beneath addressing with full sentences. "You're the one from this morning, at the entrance." "Yes." "You walked away from a direct instruction." "I heard what you said." "Then you need to explain why you didn't comply." Elena looked at him with the same kind of stillness she'd had outside, and it seemed to bother him for the same reason it had bothered him the first time, which was that it didn't read as defiance or fear or even particular concern. It read as someone waiting for him to finish. "I don't work in bag transport," she said. Felder, slightly behind Voss's right shoulder, had developed the careful expression of a man who had learned that this specific kind of exchange sometimes concluded with administrative unpleasantness for everyone present. "I don't know who you are or what your assignment is here," Voss said, "but you're going to want to figure out quickly who you're speaking to." "I know who you're speaking to," she said. It was the kind of answer that stopped conversations. Voss absorbed it, decided it was impertinence rather than something he should parse more carefully, and pointed at her. "I want your name and assignment on Felder's desk by end of day. If you're a contractor, I'll have your clearance reviewed. If you're assigned staff, I'll be speaking with Price about your conduct." He walked past her. She watched him go. Felder lingered half a step, looking at her with something that was almost an apology and also clearly wasn't going to become one, and then followed. Elena turned back toward the ER intake corridor. She had 3 more sections to walk through before she'd have everything she needed, and she intended to finish before the morning briefing Voss had scheduled for 0800 the following day. She had already sent 2 encrypted dispatches to the regional oversight office, the kind that carried routing codes Voss's communications team wouldn't know how to read even if they intercepted them. The office would have confirmed receipt. The relevant authorization to proceed had been in her coat pocket since she'd landed in Valderton. She thought about Price saying 340 trauma kits with that careful, empty face. She thought about Robles crying and then apologizing for crying and then talking anyway. She kept walking. The thing about Colonel Adrian Voss. And Elena had encountered enough men in his particular mold to have developed something close to a taxonomy, was that he was not stupid. That was important to understand. Stupid men made errors out of ignorance, and ignorance was at least a defensible position. Voss made errors out of the specific kind of confidence that insulates a person from having to examine what's actually happening around them. He'd been given authority early, had exercised it in ways that produced visible results, and had learned to manage upward with enough skill that the people positioned to evaluate him saw the performance he wanted them to see. Downward was different. Downward, Voss operated through a combination of implied threat and selective reward, and the result was a command structure that had learned to give him the results he was looking for rather than the results that existed. That distinction, compounded over months and years, produced a gap between what the paperwork said and what was actually on the shelves, and the gap was no longer small. Elena had pulled the contractor records that afternoon, using credentials that gave her access to the procurement system. Northbridge shared with 6 other facilities in the regional cluster. The trauma kit purchases were there, all of them properly processed, properly invoiced, through a logistics contractor called Halvern Medical Supply, out of a commercial address in Kildare, 3 hours west of Valderton. The quantities matched the readiness report. The delivery confirmations matched the readiness report. The signatures on the receiving documents matched the list of staff authorized to accept deliveries at Northbridge. The physical inventory did not match anything else. She ran the contractor's filing history against the central procurement database and found 3 other facilities in the cluster with similar patterns. Recorded deliveries against reduced physical counts, spread across a 14-month window, consistent enough to suggest a system rather than a series of accidents. Halvern had filed clean invoices each time. Someone had signed the receiving documents each time, and the inventory shortfalls had either gone unreported or had been reported and reclassified as reconciliation issues. She printed nothing. She exported nothing to any device that wasn't already secured. She closed the procurement window, left the terminal room, and found a quiet alcove near the stairwell where she stood for a moment with her hands in the coat pockets, looking at the floor. The scale of it had clarified in a way that changed what the morning was going to look like. This wasn't a commander cutting corners to make his unit's performance metrics look better. That happened, and it was serious, and there were established mechanisms for addressing it. This was a supply chain that had been deliberately manipulated across multiple facilities over more than a year, with contractor involvement and staff complicity at a level that suggested either significant coordination or significant coercion, possibly both. She had enough now. Arguably, she'd had enough 24 hours ago. But she'd wanted to be certain, because certainty was the only thing that protected the people like Ortega and Robles and Callahan, the people who had seen what was wrong and had been afraid to say so, when everything that was about to happen started happening. She called the secure line at 2230 from a room she'd been assigned on the 3rd floor. The line connected in under a minute. "Are we ready?" the voice on the other end asked. "Tomorrow morning," Elena said. "Voss is scheduled at 0800. I want the team in position by 0700. "Understood. Do you need additional presence on the ground?" She thought about the size of the command staff she'd be walking into. She thought about Price's careful face. "Send a JAG officer with the team. I want a lawyer in the room when I present the procurement records." "Anything else?" She looked at the coat hanging over the back of the desk chair. "No, I think we have everything we need." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the room with the sound of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled noise of the overnight ward somewhere below her. She thought about the PA who had asked if she was there to fix things or just document them, and the question had the kind of weight that stayed with you. There was a version of what was coming that was clean and procedural and would satisfy everyone's need for institutional order. Voss would be confronted, the evidence would be presented, the appropriate processes would engage, and the system would correct itself in the way systems were designed to correct themselves. Elena had been doing this long enough to know that version was incomplete. The system correcting itself was the beginning. What happened to the people who'd lived inside the failure while it was ongoing? The ones who'd filed discrepancy notices in September and been told it was a reconciliation issue. That part was harder and slower and required a different kind of attention. She picked up the coat. She checked the recorder one last time, confirmed the battery, confirmed the storage was secure, and set it on the chair with the clipboard beside it. Her uniform was in the case she'd been carrying since the airport. She had not worn it once since she'd arrived in Valderton. Tomorrow she would put it on, and the room she walked into would shift in a way she'd seen happen before. The sudden recalibration of everyone present as they reassembled their understanding of who had been in their building for 4 days in a plain gray coat, asking questions and counting shelves. She set the alarm for 0530. She was nearly asleep when her phone lit up. The message was from Felder's account, which was unusual because Felder had no reason to have her contact information, which meant either Felder had found it through channels he wasn't supposed to access or someone had given it to him. The message read, "Colonel requests your identity confirmed through facility command. Please respond with name, rank, and assignment authority. By 2300 or security review will be initiated." Elena read it twice. The timestamp was 2247. She set the phone face down on the bedside table. 13 minutes. Voss was trying to run a security review on her before morning, which meant someone had said something to him between the hallway encounter and now. Something that had moved the colonel from irritated to actually worried. Which meant someone in this building had figured out, or guessed, or been told enough to guess, that the woman in the gray coat was not what she appeared to be. She stared at the ceiling. The question wasn't whether she'd get to the briefing room at 0800. She would. The question was who else would know something had changed before she walked through that door, and how they would choose to use those 13 minutes. Her phone lit up again at 2251. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, from a Valderton area code, and the message was 3 words. He knows. Tonight. She put the phone down on the mattress and sat up in the dark. 3 words. He knows. Tonight. No name attached to the number, no follow-up, no context. Which meant whoever had sent it either trusted she would understand the implication without elaboration or was too afraid of being traced to write anything more. Both possibilities were concerning in different ways, and Elena spent about 45 seconds deciding which one to act on before she got out of bed and moved to the window. The parking structure below was lit in the amber gray of sodium lights. 2 vehicles she didn't recognize were parked near the east entrance, a dark sedan and what looked like a base pool vehicle with its lights off. Neither had been there at 2100 when she'd done her last scan before turning in. That didn't mean they were connected to anything. It also didn't mean they weren't. She pulled on clothes without turning on the room light. Dark pants, the gray coat over a pullover, boots she could walk in for a long time without thinking about them. She put the recorder in her left pocket, the authorization documents in the inside right, and her phone in her hand. She stood by the door for a moment, listening to the corridor outside. Quiet. The overnight ward sounds were faint from below, and the ventilation was steady and meaningless. She opened the door. The third-floor hallway was empty in both directions except for the cleaning cart parked near the elevator bank, which had been there since 2100 and which she'd already cataloged as belonging to a contractor crew that ran nights. She moved toward the stairwell at the far end rather than the elevator because elevators told people where you were going, and she was no longer interested in being predictable. She took the stairs to the second floor and stopped at the landing, listening again. Then she pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the administrative corridor that ran behind the conference suite and the department head offices. A light was on in Price's office. Not the overhead, the desk lamp. The narrow kind of light that meant someone was reading rather than working, or thinking rather than writing. Elena stood in the shadow of the corridor for a moment and looked at the light under the door. Then she knocked twice and waited. A pause. Movement. The door opened, and Price looked at her with the face of someone who had been expecting someone else, or possibly no one at all, and whose composure had not quite reassembled itself in time. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Price said, and stepped back to let her in. The office smelled like old coffee, and the particular kind of fatigue that accumulated in a room where someone had been spending too many late hours. Price moved around to her side of the desk, but didn't sit. She stood with her arms crossed and looked at Elena with an expression that had too many things in it to read cleanly. "You're not a contractor," Price said. "No." "And you've been here 4 days." "Yes." Price was quiet for a moment. Her jaw was tight. "I co-signed that readiness report." "I know. Which means whatever you've documented in the last 4 days, my name is on the document that contradicts it." "That's accurate," Elena said. She wasn't going to soften this because softening it would have been condescending, and Price was not a woman who needed to be managed through a difficult truth. She needed to be given the truth directly and then allowed to make a decision with it. "I need to know what you knew and when, and I need to know whether the signature on that report was yours by choice or by pressure." Price looked at her for a long time. The desk lamp threw shadows across her face in a way that made her look older than her file suggested, or maybe just more tired than her file captured. "When did Voss contact you tonight?" Elena asked. Price's chin came up a fraction. "After dinner. He'd had someone try to pull identification on you through the facility system, and it flagged a clearance level he wasn't expecting. He wanted to know who you were." "And you told him?" "I told him I didn't know." A pause. "Which was true at the time." "But you suspected." Price let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "A woman shows up in a field coat with no visible assignment, walks every corridor in the building for 4 days, asks supply questions that nobody asks unless they already know what the answers are supposed to be, and doesn't respond when a colonel tries to give her orders." She looked at Elena directly. "I suspected." "Who sent me the message tonight?" Price's expression shifted. "What message?" Elena watched her. Price wasn't performing ignorance. The confusion was real, which meant the message had come from someone else in the building, someone who had their own read on the situation and had acted on it independently. That was a variable she hadn't accounted for, and she filed it without letting it show. "Who else in the facility knew you were concerned about the readiness report?" Elena asked instead. "Ortega." Price said it without hesitation, which told Elena it was the answer she'd been sitting with all evening. He filed the discrepancy notice. "I'm the one who told him the reconciliation process would handle it." A beat. "Because that's what Voss told me to tell him." "And did you believe that?" The silence that followed wasn't evasion. It was the silence of someone who had asked themselves that question enough times to have stopped finding comfortable answers. "For the first month, maybe. After that, I was managing exposure, not expectations." Price looked at her desk. "Which is a careful way of saying I knew it wasn't right and I kept signing anyway." Elena considered her. Price had the build of someone who had been strong in a specific way for a long time and was starting to feel the weight of it. Not broken, that wasn't the right word. Something closer to exhausted, past the point where exhaustion still felt like a problem to solve. "I need to know if Voss is going to try to move anything before 0800, Elena said. "Records, personnel, his own people's accounts of events. I need to know if tonight is going to produce something I have to undo in the morning." Price looked at her. "He doesn't know who you are. He knows your clearance is above his, which will have rattled him, but he won't know what that means until you walk through that door tomorrow and he sees the uniform." She paused. "When he does, he'll try to find a way to make the readiness numbers look like a clerical issue. He'll want Felder to prep a correction memo tonight and have it filed before the briefing, so there's a paper trail suggesting the discrepancy was already being addressed internally." "Has Felder drafted anything?" "I don't know. Voss called me, not Felder." A small, unhappy compression of her mouth. "He called me because he wanted me to find out who you were. I told him I'd look into it. I didn't look into it." Elena studied her for another moment. "Can you get me into the procurement system terminal in the East Wing without logging a secondary access event?" Price blinked. "It's 2300. "Yes." "Why do you need—" Price stopped. Rearranged something in her expression. "He's going to amend the contractor records. If he can, I need to know whether he has the access level to do that unilaterally or whether he'd need someone else's credentials." Price straightened slightly. "He'd need mine." The word landed in the room and sat there. "He's going to call you again tonight," Elena said. "Probably. When he does, I need you to not answer." Price held her gaze. Then she moved to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a keycard on a plain lanyard. She set it on the desk facing Elena. "East Wing Terminal Room. This gets you in without logging to the main system. Maintenance access." She paused. "I had it pulled 8 months ago because I thought I was going to do something about the discrepancy myself. I didn't." Another pause, shorter. "Don't let him amend those contractor records." Elena picked up the keycard. "Are you going to be all right?" Price looked at her with an expression that said the question was almost funny and also not funny at all. "I'll be better after tomorrow," she said. "Assuming tomorrow goes the way I think you're planning it to." Elena left her in the lamplight and moved back into the corridor. The East Wing terminal room was cold and smelled of old plastic casing and the specific mustiness of a space that processed air without warming it. The keycard worked on the second swipe. Elena moved to the primary terminal, pulled up the procurement system with Price's maintenance credentials, and ran a query on Halvern Medical Supplies account activity in the last 6 hours. There was an amendment request queued. It had been submitted at 22:09, 17 minutes before Felder's message to her phone, and it was flagged as pending authorization. The request was to reclassify 228 trauma kit units as having been transferred to an off-site storage facility in Kildare, retroactively dated to October, which would have reduced the apparent discrepancy between the physical inventory and the readiness report to a number small enough to credibly attribute to processing delays. The amendment required a co-authorization from a facility command officer before it could be processed. Price's credentials were attached as the originating authority, which meant someone had either used Price's access to initiate the request without her knowledge, or had generated the request through Halvern's contractor portal using a secondary channel Elena hadn't mapped yet. Either way, the amendment hadn't been authorized yet, and it required one more signature to go through. She flagged the pending request for immediate hold through the regional oversight access that her authorization package included. The system logged it as a security review hold, which would generate an automated alert to the oversight office and prevent any processing of the amendment until the hold was manually released by someone with regional authorization, which at this facility meant nobody except Elena herself. She logged out. She stood in the cold terminal room for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The request had been submitted at 22:09, which meant that by 22:09, Voss had already known he had a problem, and his first move had been paperwork rather than confrontation. That was useful information. Voss was worried enough to try to cover the records, but not yet panicked enough to do something loud about it, which suggested he still believed the situation was containable through administrative channels. He didn't yet understand what he was actually dealing with. He would understand it at 0800. Elena let herself out of the terminal room and moved back toward the stairwell. She was 3 steps up when the corridor light at the base of the stairs switched on behind her. She stopped. Footsteps. One set. Moving without particular urgency. She turned. The man standing at the base of the stairwell was not someone she recognized from any staff file she'd reviewed. Mid-40s, in a base-issue jacket, over civilian clothes, the kind of build that came from physical work sustained over many years and then somewhat reduced. He had a Northbridge contractor badge clipped to his jacket but no tool bag, which was the first thing wrong with him, and he was standing with his hands visible and open, which suggested he was making an effort to appear unthreatening and understood that the effort was necessary. "You're the one who's been asking about the supply count," he said. Not a question. "Who are you?" "Decker. Dale Decker. I drove for Halvern for 14 months. He said it flat, like he'd been rehearsing how to say it. "I've been on base staff for 3 months since I stopped driving. Maintenance contract." He paused. "I sent you the message tonight." Elena looked at him. "From a Valderton number." "My personal phone, I know how that looks." "Why didn't you come to me directly?" "Because I didn't know who you were until about an hour ago, when word got around that someone had flagged a high clearance block on an identity query." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been trying to figure out who to talk to for 3 months. The kind of person I wanted to talk to doesn't usually walk around in a field coat counting shelves." Elena studied him. His body language was consistent, nervous but not evasive, the specific discomfort of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a while and was trying to put it down carefully. "What were you delivering for Halvern?" "Medical kits mostly. First 3 months, everything was standard. I'd pick up from the warehouse in Kildare, drive to whatever facility was on the manifest, offload, get a signature, leave. Everything matched." He paused. "Then the manifest started changing, not all at once, a little at a time. I'd pick up 40 kits, the manifest would say 40, but when I got to the facility, they'd sign for 40 and I'd only offload 32. And the 8? Got picked up from the truck at a transit point outside Valderton, private lot. Same guy every time, different vehicle. He had paperwork, clearance-looking documents, the whole thing. I asked about it once, and my dispatcher told me it was a consolidated transfer, that those units were going to a secondary facility not on my route, and I should stop asking questions if I wanted to keep the contract." His jaw worked. "I kept the contract for 8 more months. I need you to know I understand what that makes me." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Do you have any documentation? Anything you kept from those runs? He reached into his jacket and produced a folded envelope, the kind with a bubble interior, creased from being carried for what looked like a significant amount of time. Photographs from my personal phone, the guy who met me at the transit point. I got his plate twice, different occasions, the secondary paperwork he used. I didn't hand it over during the run, I photographed it after. He held the envelope out. I wasn't going to say anything as long as I thought nobody important was paying attention. Then you started counting shelves, and I thought maybe someone was finally paying attention. She took the envelope. I'm going to need a formal statement from you in the morning, in front of a JAG officer. That's going to put your contractor status in jeopardy and possibly generate an inquiry into your own conduct during those runs. I know. Are you prepared for that? I've been sleeping on it for 3 months, he said. Yeah, I'm prepared. She looked at him a moment longer. He had the face of someone who had made a bad choice and had known it was a bad choice and had not been fully able to stop himself from making it anyway, which was a very human kind of thing and not the same as being a bad person. Though the distinction would need to be determined through a process she was not the only person administering. 0700, she said. Conference room, 2nd floor. Don't come in uniform. Maintenance clothes are fine. He nodded. She moved past him and up the stairs. She made it back to her room by midnight and set the alarm again for 0530. She lay on top of the covers because lying under them felt like a commitment to sleep that her brain wasn't ready to honor, and she went through the morning sequence methodically. The order of evidence she'd present, the moment she'd introduce herself formally, the questions she expected from the command staff, the specific look Voss was going to have when he understood what was happening. She'd seen that look before on other men in rooms like this one. It was never the same twice, which was the part she'd never quite gotten used to. Each time a person understood that the floor they'd been standing on was not the floor they thought it was. The understanding moved through them differently. Some went cold, some went loud, some went very still in a way that was worse than both. She didn't know yet which way Voss would go. She knew he would try to find an exit that preserved something, his record, his authority, his version of events, because that was always the first move. And she knew that the exit she would be offering him was narrower than he expected, and involved considerably more accounting for what he had actually done than men like Voss typically found acceptable. At 0247, her phone lit up. Not a message, a call. The unknown Valderton number. She answered. Decker. A breath, then. They came to my quarters 20 minutes ago, 2 of Voss's people. Told me I was being reassigned to a remote maintenance detail starting tomorrow morning before shift briefing. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort it was taking. That's not a reassignment. That's removal. Elena sat up. Where are you now? Still in my quarters. I told them I needed to pack. I've been trying to figure out if I should run or... Don't run, she said. And don't go with them in the morning. Tell them you received a direct facility order conflicting with the reassignment and you need command clarification before complying. Use those exact words. Then come to the 2nd floor at 0630 and find Sergeant Ortega's name on the staff board and wait near that door. What if they don't wait for me to say all that? Then call this number and stay on the line. She paused. This is not going to go the way they're expecting tomorrow. You understand that? A longer pause. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what you can actually do before 0800. Neither does Voss, she said, which is the relevant point. She hung up and lay back down with the phone on her chest. The ceiling was gray in the dark. The ventilation cycled on and the room got slightly warmer and then less slightly. Voss was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant the flagged amendment hold had either been discovered or he'd had someone watching for exactly that kind of security intervention. He was trying to reduce his exposure by removing the person with direct knowledge of the transit point before the morning briefing could give that person a protected platform. Elena was used to investigations that produced clean sequences. This one was becoming something more procedural and compressed and human, which was harder to control and also harder to dismiss. She calculated what she could do before 0530 and what would have to wait until 0800, and what, if she were honest with herself, she couldn't fully anticipate. The authorization she carried was broad but not unlimited. If Voss moved against Decker tonight in a way that generated physical documentation of interference with a witness, even a potential witness, that changed the nature of what the morning briefing would become. She was nearly through this calculation when she heard footsteps in the corridor. not the cleaning cart, not the overnight movement of a staff member going to the ward. These were deliberate, and they slowed outside her door and stopped. She was already at the wall beside the door by the time the knock came. 3 sharp raps. Then a voice she recognized. Felder. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you. I know what time it is." She looked at the closed door. Felder had always struck her as the kind of aide who served because it was structurally convenient and stayed because leaving required a kind of decision he hadn't yet worked up to. But he was also the one who had been in that hallway this morning with the almost apology that hadn't become one. And he was here at 0250 with a voice that carried something different from what she'd heard in the corridor. She opened the door. Felder looked like a man who had not slept, and had also spent the hours he hadn't slept, making a decision that had gotten heavier each hour he'd delayed it. He was in a base jacket over a t-shirt, boots unlaced, and he had a tablet in his left hand held face down against his leg. "You need to come with me," he said. "Where?" "The East Supply Corridor." He swallowed. Voss sent 2 people there an hour ago. Not to move records, to move the physical inventory. Elena looked at him. "They're relocating the kits." "What's left of them, yes." His voice had the specific flatness of someone recounting something they found genuinely difficult. "They're going to move them into the count-accessible storage area and report them as having been located following an internal audit. It'll match the report number well enough that in a cursory review, where's Voss now?" "His office. He's been on the phone most of the evening." "And you're telling me this because?" Felder was quiet for about 3 seconds. "Because I've been writing his talking points for 2 years, and I know what those reports actually say, and I know what the shelves actually hold, and I've been telling myself it wasn't my problem." He looked at her with the uncomfortable directness of someone who had stopped managing their own expression. "And then tonight he told me to draft the amendment request, and I did it, and then I sat in my room and looked at what I'd typed, and I couldn't make myself send it." Elena moved past him into the corridor. "Come with me." "I'm not—" He followed anyway. "I'm not sure what I am in all of this, legally." "That's a fair question and it'll get a fair answer, but not right now." She was already moving toward the stairwell. "Right now I need you to show me exactly where they're moving those kits and how many people Voss sent to do it." Felder followed her down the stairs, and behind them the 3rd-floor corridor stayed quiet, and the room she'd been in stayed dark. And somewhere in the building, 2 men who didn't know what morning was about to look like were moving boxes of emergency equipment from one shelf to another and believing it would be enough. It would not be enough. But Elena needed to be in that corridor before they finished, because the location of those kits in the 20 minutes before she confronted Voss was going to be the difference between a procedural correction and something that carried the word obstruction in the official record. An obstruction, unlike negligence, did not resolve itself through supervision and retraining. She pushed the stairwell door open and Felder was right behind her, and at the base of the stairs, the East Wing corridor stretched ahead of them, and at the far end of it, light was showing under the supply room door. She didn't run. Running announced you, and she needed 30 more seconds of not being announced. Elena moved down the East Wing corridor at a pace that looked like purpose without urgency, and Felder matched her stride without being told to, which told her he'd made his decision somewhere on those stairs and had stopped second-guessing it, at least for now. The light under the supply room door was steady, not the moving sweep of flashlights, which meant whoever was in there had turned on the overheads and wasn't particularly worried about being seen. That was either confidence or carelessness, and she'd find out which in about 15 seconds. She pushed the door open. 2 men in base-issue work clothes looked up from a stack of trauma kit cases they'd been moving from the rear shelving unit toward the primary inventory area near the door. One was large and went still with the specific stillness of someone caught mid-action who hasn't yet decided how to respond to being caught. The other was younger, and he took one step back and then stopped because stepping back wasn't actually a plan. Neither was anyone she recognized from Voss's formal detail. Base staff, pulled for off-hours work, which meant Voss had been careful enough not to use his own people for the physical part of this. "Stop," Elena said. The large one found his response. "This is a maintenance repositioning. We have authorization from— Put the cases down and step away from the shelving." A pause. The large man looked at Felder, which was a mistake because Felder had the expression of a man who was no longer on the side. He'd been on this morning, and that was apparently legible enough to read in the overhead light of a supply room at 0300. They put the cases down. Elena moved to the rear shelving and counted what had already been repositioned. 11 cases had been moved from the back wall to the primary area. 11 cases that in the morning's physical count would have appeared to be part of the accessible inventory rather than the material that had been sitting uncounted against the wrong wall. Not enough to close the gap entirely, but enough to muddy the water on a cursory review, which was probably all Voss had been hoping for. She photographed the current configuration with her phone. The rear wall. The 11 cases in the primary area. The 2 men standing near the door. The timestamp would embed automatically. "Sit down," she said to them. "Both of you. On the floor." The large one started to object. She looked at him with the kind of patience that had no warmth in it, and he sat down. The younger one sat without being told twice. She turned to Felder. "Call security. Base military police, not facility staff. They'll call Voss." "I know. Make the call." Felder made the call. She could hear his voice behind her, steady in a way she suspected was costing him something, giving the room number and the situation without editorializing. While he talked, she moved through the supply room systematically, photographing everything, the rear shelving, the inventory tags, the cases that hadn't been moved yet, the clipboard hanging near the entrance with the maintenance authorization form that had been signed by a name she didn't recognize and dated 2 hours ago. She photographed the authorization form 3 times from different angles. The large man on the floor said, "We were just doing what we were told." "I know," Elena said. "That's going to be relevant to your situation, and someone will take your account of events. Right now, I need you to stay where you are." Military police arrived in 8 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than she'd expected, which meant either they'd been awake already, or whoever had taken Felder's call had moved quickly. 2 officers, both young, both professional enough to read the room without asking for a detailed explanation first. Elena identified herself with the authorization card she'd been carrying since Valderton, and she watched both officers reassemble their understanding of the situation in real time. "I need these 2 men held separately and formally," she said, "and I need this room sealed for evidence documentation. Nothing moves in or out without my direct authorization." "Yes, ma'am." The senior officer, a Corporal Rice with a straight posture and careful eyes, looked at the 2 men on the floor and then at the repositioned cases and clearly had enough experience to understand what he was looking at. "Are we expecting additional personnel this morning?" "Yes, seal the corridor from the stairwell junction." Rice moved to do that without further question. Elena appreciated efficiency in people who'd just been handed a situation they hadn't anticipated. She stepped outside the supply room with Felder. The corridor was quiet. 318. Less than 5 hours until the briefing. "Voss knows the MPs are here by now," Felder said. "Yes. He's going to try to contain this before morning, remove himself from direct association with the repositioning. He'll say it was a maintenance decision that didn't require his sign-off." Elena looked at him. "Is that what you would have written for him?" A pause. "Yes, probably." "What stopped you tonight?" Felder thought about it. He did it honestly, which she hadn't been certain he would. "I drafted the amendment request and it looked exactly right. Every word was in the right place, and I looked at it and thought, this is what I'm good at, making wrong things look exactly right." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing it for 2 years. I'm genuinely very good at it." Elena let that sit without comment. It was the kind of self-knowledge that arrived late and hurt specifically because of the lateness. "Go back to your quarters," she said. "Don't contact anyone in Voss's detail. At 0630, come to the second-floor conference room. I'll have a JAG officer present. You'll give a formal statement, and then we'll determine your position in the morning's proceedings. And if Voss tries to reach me before then, don't answer." She paused. "Can you do that?" "I've been answering every call he's made for 2 years," Felder said. "I think I can manage one night." She watched him walk back toward the stairwell. Then she went back into the supply room and spent the next 40 minutes working with Corporal Rice to document the inventory state precisely. Every case counted, photographed, logged against the readiness report numbers, with Rice as a formal witness to the count. 112 serviceable trauma kits in the accessible inventory area, plus the 11 that had been repositioned tonight and which she logged separately with a notation of the circumstances. The rear storage yielded nothing additional. The count was what it was. She left the supply room sealed with Rice on the door and went back upstairs. At 0500, she was in uniform for the first time since she'd arrived in Valderton. She put it on the way she always put it on, methodically, without theatrics, each element in the sequence she'd followed for more years than she liked to count at 6 in the morning. The difference between the gray coat and the uniform wasn't about authority. She'd had the same authority either way. It was about clarity. Today required clarity. She checked the recorder, fully charged. She checked the documentation package, the procurement records, the amendment hold confirmation, the inventory photographs, Decker's envelope, the supply room documentation from the night, the contact logs. Everything organized in a sequence that told the story in the order she wanted it told. At 0620, she went to the second floor. The JAG officer, Major Harlan Pruitt, had arrived with the pre-dawn team and was already set up in the anteroom off the conference suite with a recording device and the specific organized efficiency of a man who had done formal witness statements in stranger circumstances than this. He had the kind of face that was impossible to read under normal conditions and became actively uninformative under pressure, which was a valuable quality in his line of work. Pruitt looked up when she walked in. He took in the uniform with one measured glance. General Vera? Major, we have 2 witness statements before 0800. A Mr. Dale Decker, maintenance contractor, former Halvern driver, and a Captain Marcus Felder, Colonel Voss's aide. Decker arrives at 0630, Felder shortly after. Decker's statement involves direct observation of secondary cargo transfers during Halvern supply runs. Felder's involves the amendment request filed at 2209, and his knowledge of the supply repositioning authorized this morning. Pruitt wrote without looking up. Both voluntary? Both voluntary and both initiated contact with me independently. Noted. He looked up. How's the rest of the room going to look at 0800? Complicated. Elena set her documentation package on the table. Price co-signed the readiness report under pressure. I'll be presenting her position separately from the others. I want her statement taken after Voss is formally confronted, not before. Understood. Anything else before we start? The 2 base staff members from the supply room repositioning are with MPs. I want their statements added to the record, but they're low priority for the morning. They were acting on instruction and cooperated immediately when stopped. Pruitt nodded. Clean it up later. Clean it up later, she agreed. Decker arrived at 0628 in his maintenance clothes with the envelope she'd already taken from him, and a second item she hadn't seen before. A folded work log with handwritten margin notes covering 6 months of routes. He sat across from Pruitt with the expression of someone who had moved past fear into the particular steadiness that came on the other side of fear, and he answered every question in flat, specific language that corresponded with the photographs in his envelope and 3 delivery dates that matched anomalous entries in Halvern's contractor records. The transit point, the vehicle plates, the man who'd shown up twice, the paperwork he'd photographed because something had felt wrong enough to document even when he'd been too afraid to do anything else with what he'd documented. Pruitt recorded all of it. When Decker was done, he looked at Elena and she told him to wait in the anteroom and that he'd done the right thing by coming forward. He nodded and went to wait. Felder arrived at 0641 and gave his statement with the kind of precision that came from 2 years of writing briefings. He was a man who knew how to structure information, and he structured his own culpability with the same care, which made it simultaneously thorough and difficult to listen to. Pruitt recorded it and thanked him in the formal way that meant nothing and everything, and Felder sat in the anteroom with Decker and probably didn't speak because there was nothing for them to say to each other. At 0745, Elena stood in the corridor outside the conference suite and looked at the closed door. She could hear voices inside. Voss's among them, and Price's, and 2 or 3 others she'd identified as department heads from earlier in the week. The briefing was scheduled for 0800. Voss had arrived early, which meant he'd been trying to set the room before she walked into it. She waited until 0802. Let him have the extra 2 minutes. Let the room settle into his rhythm. Then she opened the door. The conference suite held 11 people when Elena walked in. Voss was at the front, already mid-sentence, and the sentence stopped with the kind of clean stop that happened when a room's attention shifted to something more urgent than whatever was being said. She walked to the front of the room without hurrying. Voss had 2 seconds to look at her. The uniform, the rank insignia, the same face from the parking apron and the corridor. And she watched the moment land. It wasn't the cold that she'd half expected, or the loud which she'd half prepared for. It was something that moved through his face like a structural adjustment, like something load-bearing had shifted and the rest of the face was catching up. "Colonel Voss," she said, "thank you for assembling the command staff. I'll be adding some material to this morning's briefing." She placed the documentation package on the table in front of her and looked at the room. Price was at the far end of the table with her hands flat on the surface and her expression doing the careful, contained thing it did. Two department heads she recognized from the week's informal observations, a Major Caulfield and a lieutenant colonel named Brasted, were exchanging the kind of look that people exchanged when they'd suspected something for a long time, and it was arriving in a form they still weren't entirely prepared for. "My name is Elena Vieira. I hold the rank of Major General, and I've been conducting a readiness and compliance evaluation at Northbridge Military Medical Center for the past 5 days." She paused one beat. "The evaluation is complete." Voss found his voice. "General, I wasn't informed of any." "That's correct? You weren't." She looked at him directly. "That's a standard feature of evaluations conducted at this clearance level when there's a predicate concern about command compliance. I have authorization documentation if you'd like to review it." He didn't respond to that. She opened the package. "I'm going to present the findings in sequence. I'd ask the command staff to hold questions until I've completed the presentation, because the material is interconnected and isolated questions will be more clearly addressed after the full picture is visible." She started with the physical inventory. Photographs on the display screen at the front of the room, the supply corridor, the shelving, the count log witnessed by Corporal Rice. 112 serviceable trauma kits in accessible inventory against a readiness report claiming 340. The room was very quiet. She moved to the procurement records. Halvern Medical Supplies filing history against the Central Procurement Database. The consistent pattern across 4 facilities in the regional cluster over 14 months. The amendment request filed at 22:09 the previous night, now under security hold. She moved to the contractor delivery evidence. Decker's photographs, logged and admitted through Prewitt's formal statement process. The vehicle plates from the transit point outside Valderton, now flagged for federal cross-referencing through the Oversight Office. The secondary paperwork from the cargo pickups, the document that created the fictional consolidated transfer that explained away units that had never arrived at any secondary facility. She moved to the supply room repositioning, the photographs from 0300. The authorization form signed by a name that was not on any formal staff order. The testimony of 2 base staff members who had been directed to move physical inventory in the middle of the night. Each section produced its own quality of silence. The supply count silence was the first kind, the kind where people were recalibrating. The procurement pattern silence was the second kind, where people were starting to understand the scale. By the time she reached the overnight repositioning, the room had gone to the third kind of silence, which was the kind that meant nobody was looking at Voss anymore because looking at him felt like too direct a thing. Voss himself had gone still. He was looking at the display screen and his face had the quality of a man watching something he'd built for a long time coming apart in a sequence he couldn't interrupt. He tried once. "General, the supply discrepancy was identified as a reconciliation. The discrepancy notice was filed by Sergeant Ortega in September," Elena said, without inflection. "It was reclassified as a reconciliation issue on instruction from this command. The reconciliation was never completed. The January readiness report was submitted with the same incorrect count as the previous 2 quarters. There were processing delays that—" "The amendment request filed at 22:09 last night," Elena said, "attempted to reclassify 228 missing units as having been transferred to an off-site facility in October. The transfer never occurred. The off-site facility has no record of the units. The amendment would have created a retroactive paper trail for equipment that was diverted through a secondary pickup operation over 14 months. She looked at him. "I need you to tell me who at Halvern Medical Supply coordinated the transit point pickups." The room waited. Voss said nothing. "Colonel?" Her voice didn't change. "You have 2 options this morning. The first is a full cooperative disclosure, which becomes part of the record in a way that the JAG office will weigh when determining the appropriate proceedings. The second is a refusal to cooperate, which also becomes part of the record and carries a different weight." She paused. I need your answer now, not after you've had time to reach anyone by phone. Voss's jaw was tight. He looked at the table. He looked at the display screen. He looked briefly at Price, who was looking at her hands. I want a lawyer present, he said. Major Prewitt is already in the building. Elena looked at Corporal Rice, who was standing near the door. Corporal, please escort Colonel Voss to the anteroom and ask Major Prewitt to begin formal proceedings. Rice moved. Voss stood up from the table with the careful movements of a man managing the distance between his external composure and whatever was happening on the inside, and he walked to the door without looking at anyone in the room, and the door closed behind him. The remaining 10 people in the conference suite produced the specific quality of exhale that a room produced when a long pressure had been released and nobody was quite sure yet what the pressure-free version of. Elena looked at the room. I want to be clear that this evaluation has identified failures at multiple levels, and the investigation going forward will require full cooperation from everyone in this command. That means documentation reviews, personal statements, and in some cases, formal interviews with the JAG office. She looked at Price. Lieutenant Colonel Price, I'd like to speak with you separately after this session. Price met her eyes and nodded once. The next 4 hours were the kind of sustained procedural intensity that looked nothing like the movies and felt like nothing so much as very high-stakes paperwork conducted at speed in rooms that were too warm. Prewitt worked through the formal proceedings with Voss in the anteroom, and the answers came slowly, and then not slowly, because Voss was not a stupid man, and the evidence had been assembled in a way that left him very few defensible positions, and he understood this faster than some men did. He gave up the Halvern contact at 10:40. The name was a logistics director called Merritt Bohl, who had been coordinating the secondary pickups through a shell company with a commercial address in Kildare. Bohl had suppliers on 3 other military contracts in the regional cluster, and the scope of what he'd been running widened immediately and significantly once Prewitt had the name and the oversight office had been contacted with authorization to begin federal cross-referencing. Elena was in the anteroom when Voss gave the name. She was present because Prewitt had asked her to be, and because she'd wanted to see Voss's face when he said it. He said it looking at the table, in the flat voice of a man who had stopped performing, which in its way was the most honest she'd seen him. How long has Bohl been pulling from this facility? She asked. 14 months. Voss was quiet for a moment. He approached me through an intermediary, said the units were going to Allied facilities that had been shorted through the national supply chain, that the paperwork would be clean, that nobody would be looking at the secondary transfer. I said no the first time, but not the second. His jaw moved. The intermediary had documentation of a prior conversation about the supply shortfalls that I'd had with Bohl. Taken out of context, it looked like I'd been involved from the start. He paused. I understood that saying no a second time would cost me more than saying yes. Elena looked at him. She'd heard variations of this explanation before, the initial refusal, the manufactured leverage, the decision to cooperate because the cost of not cooperating was made to appear higher than the cost of the original compromise. It was a real pattern, and it was genuinely coercive, and it was also not the end of a man's moral responsibility, because there had been a window between the second yes and the moment the first discrepancy report landed on his desk when he could have made a different choice, and he hadn't. You had a discrepancy report in September, she said, after you'd already committed. You had an officer telling you the count was wrong, and you had a choice about what to do with that information. Voss didn't answer. You chose Ortega's career over your own exposure, she said, and you chose the same way every time after that. Still nothing. She stood up and left Prewitt to complete the formal record. The oversight team from the regional office arrived at 1300, 4 people, 3 of whom moved immediately to the procurement terminals, and one of whom, a civilian investigator named Casper, came directly to Elena with a briefcase and the expression of a person who had been told the situation was significant and had arrived to find that the situation was, if anything, more significant than described. Bohl, he said. Prewitt has the full statement. Bohl's been running secondary extractions from at least 4 facilities in the cluster. I have delivery documentation from a former Halvern driver covering 6 months of runs and 2 plate IDs from the transit point outside Valderton. She handed him Decker's envelope. The shell company address in Kildare will need a search warrant. Casper took the envelope with the care of someone receiving something they understood would matter in a room she wasn't going to be in. How much total material? From this facility alone, roughly 228 trauma kits over 14 months, based on the procurement records. If the pattern holds across the other 3 facilities, the figure is significantly larger. It'll hold, Casper said, with the flat certainty of a man who had seen enough patterns to trust them. These operations don't customize themselves by facility. They use the same template until someone finds it. Someone found it, Elena said. Casper looked at her with an expression that was almost dry. Someone walked around in a coat for 4 days, yes. He snapped the briefcase shut. We'll take it from here on the contractor side. You'll need to stay on site for the command accountability process? Until it's structured and stable, probably another week. He nodded and moved toward the terminal room. Elena watched him go and then went to find Price. Price was in her office with the door open and the desk lamp on again, which seemed to be her natural state. She had a cup of something on the desk that had probably been hot an hour ago and wasn't anymore, and she was looking at a stack of documents without reading them. Elena sat down across from her without being invited. Price didn't object. Prewitt will need your statement, Elena said. I know. Your position is complicated but not unresolvable. You co-signed under sustained command pressure from a superior officer. You didn't initiate the amendment request, and you declined to provide your credentials when Voss tried to use them last night. Elena paused. That's the shape of your situation. A JAG review will weigh it against your 7 years of otherwise clean service. Price was quiet. Is that your assessment or what you're telling me to manage my anxiety? Both, Elena said, and neither one is inaccurate. Price looked at her hands. Ortega filed in September. I had the discrepancy notice on my desk, and I handed it back down with a reconciliation instruction. I told him the system would correct it. She paused. He trusted me. Elena didn't offer anything to soften that. It was true, and it mattered, and the weight of it was something Price was going to carry through whatever came next, which was also something she would carry alongside the fact that she'd handed over a maintenance keycard in the middle of the night and left a light on in her office and not answered Voss's calls. He trusted you, and then he photographed the inventory count on 3 separate mornings and kept accurate records anyway, Elena said. People can do both things. Price looked up. Trust you and document you at the same time. It's not a contradiction. The desk lamp threw the same shadows it had at 2300, and the office smelled the same, and Price looked the same way she'd looked then, except that the containment had been replaced by something more tired and less calculated, which was its own kind of relief. What happens to the facility? Price asked. That depends on what the command accountability process produces. My recommendation will be a supervised rebuild. Every record, every kit, every staff account reviewed under direct oversight for a defined period. It's harder than a simple disciplinary action, and it takes longer, but it produces something functional on the other side, rather than a facility with the same gaps under different management. And Voss? That's the JAG process, not mine to determine. But you'll make a recommendation. Elena considered. I'll make an honest assessment of what I observed, which is that he was coerced into an initial compromise and then made progressively worse choices to protect his exposure. Whether that's a mitigation or an aggravation depends on how you weigh the harm to the people who served under him. She paused. I think it's both. Price looked at her for a long moment. This morning, when you walked in, the uniform. She paused. I knew what was coming, and I still felt it. What did you feel? Like the floor shifted, Price said. Like everything I'd been standing on reorganized itself. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if that was relief or terror. Might have been both of those too, Elena said. She stood up. She had 3 more hours of documentation and 2 calls to the regional office and a formal recommendation to draft before she could eat anything, which had become a low-priority item and was starting to reassert itself. She was almost at the door when Price spoke again. The medics on the overnight rotation, Price said. Callahan, Reyes, the others. They've been covering the gaps for 2 years with whatever they could improvise. They never filed a report because the report process went nowhere. Her voice was careful. They should be part of what comes next, whatever the rebuild looks like. Elena turned back. I've already put that in the preliminary draft. Price nodded and went back to looking at the papers on her desk. and Elena went out into the hallway where the morning light had moved through the windows and reached the far wall. And somewhere on the floors below her, the overnight rotation was handing off to the day shift, and nurses and medics who had been improvising solutions to a problem nobody powerful had been willing to name were beginning another day of doing exactly that. She took out her phone and called the regional office. While it rang, she heard movement on the stairwell. Two oversight team members going up with a cart of equipment, talking to each other in the low-efficient register of people who had a lot of work to do and had started doing it. The line connected. Regional Oversight, Captain Slade. Slade, it's Vera. I need to add a federal contractor inquiry to the Valderton filing, Shell Company Trace and Calder, and a warrant request for a logistics director named Merritt Bowl. She moved toward the window as she talked. And I need the procurement anomaly flags expanded to include facilities in the cluster that share Halvern's contract. The pattern doesn't stop at Northbridge. There was a pause on the line, the brief kind where someone was writing fast. How wide are we talking? Slade asked. Elena looked out the window at the parking structure below. The dark sedan she'd seen at 0300 was gone. The pool vehicle was gone. In their place, two vehicles from the Regional Oversight Office were parked with their markings visible, which was very different from what the parking structure had looked like 4 days ago, and also exactly what it should look like now. I don't know yet, she said, but Bowles been running this for over a year, and this wasn't his first contract. Find out every facility he's serviced in the last 3 years, and flag them all for preliminary review. She was about to say something else when she heard the sound, fast, coming from below, the kind of sound a stairwell made when someone was taking it at a pace that wasn't normal building movement. She turned from the window. The stairwell door hit the wall as it opened. Corporal Rice came through it at a speed that meant the careful professionalism of the morning had been replaced by something urgent. General. He was breathing harder than a flight of stairs warranted. It's Voss. He's not in the anteroom. Elena went still. Prewitt? Prewitt took a call, stepped out for 4 minutes. When he went back in, the room was empty. Rice's voice was controlled, but barely. We have the building exits monitored, but the East Corridor camera has been offline since 0900. Maintenance issue logged this morning. If he went east... Elena was already moving. Where's Felder? Still in the anteroom. Didn't move. He says he doesn't know anything about Voss leaving, but... Rice stopped. But what? His phone is gone, Rice said. Felder's. It's not in the anteroom. We think Voss took it when he left. Elena processed this in the time it took her to reach the stairwell door. Voss had Felder's phone, which meant Voss had a device that wasn't flagged, that wasn't being monitored, that had contacts in it that Felder had built over 2 years of working as a senior aide for a regional command colonel. Contacts that included, probably, people at facilities she hadn't yet reached, people who had information they were going to want to move before the oversight expansion she'd just described to Slade could catch it. How long ago? She said. We noticed 4 minutes ago. Prewitt thinks he was gone before that. Could be 10 minutes total. 10 minutes with Felder's phone, she did the math. Seal every exit you haven't already and get a vehicle to the east perimeter. She was through the stairwell door. And get Casper on the line. I need federal reach on Bowles' contacts in the next 60 seconds before Voss makes a call we can't undo. She took the stairs at a speed she hadn't moved at since well before Valderton, and behind her Rice was already on his radio, and ahead of her the East Wing waited with its sealed supply room and its documented inventory and its camera that had gone offline at exactly the wrong time, and somewhere in the building or beyond it, Adrian Voss was using 60 borrowed seconds to do damage she didn't yet know the shape of. Her phone rang in her hand. The screen said Caspar. She answered it at a dead run, and Caspar's voice came through with the tight quality of someone who had just received information that changed the morning's parameters significantly. Vera, he said. Bowles' Calder address just went active. We have a vehicle leaving the premises. Which direction? Elena said. North, toward the highway junction. Caspar's voice was clipped and functional. I've got 2 federal vehicles available, but they're 12 minutes out from Calder. Stay on Bowl. Don't let that vehicle get to the highway. She hit the ground floor at a run and pushed through the East Corridor door. What did Voss call him on? We don't know yet. We picked up the activity through a flag on Bowles' known contact numbers, but the originating device isn't registered to Voss. Felder's phone. Unregistered to Voss. invisible to the monitoring that had been placed on Voss's own devices at 0800 when Prewitt began formal proceedings. He'd known, or guessed, that his own phone was compromised, and he'd taken Felder's because Felder's wasn't, and he'd used the 4 minutes that Prewitt stepped out to make one call to the one person whose disappearance would do the most damage to the evidence chain before federal reach arrived in Caldera. It was, she had to acknowledge, a competent move. Not a clean one, not a moral one, but structurally competent in the way that men who had spent 2 decades managing institutional exposure tended to be when their backs were against something solid. Voss hasn't left the building, she said, more to herself than Casper, because the math wasn't adding up to escape. The exits were monitored. Rice had confirmed everything except the East Corridor camera was live. Voss hadn't run, Shio. He'd made a phone call, which meant his objective wasn't to disappear. It was to make something happen before she could stop it. Casper, does Bowles' vehicle have passengers? A pause with movement behind it. Checking. Another pause. Aerial shows 2 occupants. 2. Bowles wouldn't run alone if he was running. He'd run with whoever held the secondary documentation, whoever could corroborate the shell company's function, whoever carried the financial records that connected the procurement fraud to the accounts that had received the money. If Bowles had a partner in the vehicle, Elena needed to know that partner's identity before the federal vehicles intercepted them, because the identity would define the full scope of the network. Get me eyes on the passenger, she said. Whatever you can. She came around the east wing corner and nearly walked into Rice, who had come from the opposite direction with the specific expression of someone delivering information he didn't want to deliver. We found Voss, Rice said. She stopped. Where? 3rd floor, the room you were assigned. Rice's jaw was tight. He's been there since he left the anteroom. He wasn't running, General. He was waiting. Elena looked at him for 1 second. Waiting for what? We don't know. He's locked the door from the inside, not responding to MP orders to open it. She moved past Rice and back toward the stairwell. Casper was still on the line. Stay on Bowles, she said into the phone. Call me when you have an ID on the passenger. She ended the call and took the stairs. The 3rd floor corridor had 3 MPs outside the room she'd slept in, which was a tableau she hadn't anticipated when she'd set her alarm for 0530. The door was standard internal, not reinforced, not designed to hold against sustained pressure. But the MPs hadn't breached it because breaching it without authorization generated a separate procedural problem, and everyone was already managing enough of those. She walked to the door and knocked once. Voss, open the door. A pause. Then his voice came through, stripped of the performance layer that had been on it all morning. What was underneath was tired and something close to resigned, which was not the same as cooperative. I need 5 minutes, he said. You've had 10. Open the door now. Another pause, longer. Then the lock disengaged. Voss was standing near the window, not at it, like he'd been looking out and had stepped back when he heard her knock. Still in uniform, jacket open, phone on the desk. He looked like a man who had sat down with a very large problem and hadn't found a position that worked. She looked at the phone, then at him. Felder's phone. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced it. She took it. Who else did you call? He looked at the window. Nobody. Just Bowles. What did you tell him? To get out. A pause. To get out and take the ledger. Elena went very still. What ledger? Voss turned from the window. His face had the quality of a man who had stopped managing the distance between what he knew and what he said, and it made him look different. Not better, exactly, but more present. Less constructed. Bowles kept a transaction ledger, physical copy, not digital. Names, amounts, transfer dates, facility codes. Every extraction from every facility in the cluster for the past 3 years. He told me about it when he first approached me, said it was insurance, said it meant I couldn't expose him without exposing myself. A pause. I wasn't wrong about that. Where's the ledger? He keeps it off-site, separate from the Caldera address. If he's running, he'll go there first before he goes anywhere else, because without it, his version of events doesn't hold and he knows it. Elena looked at him steadily. You're telling me this now, after making a call that gave him a 12-minute head start. I made the call because I panicked. He said it without the tone of a man looking for sympathy, which was the only thing that made it possible to hear. And then I came up here and sat with what I'd done, and I decided it was the last bad decision I was willing to make. She held his gaze for a moment. He was telling the truth. She could read it in the quality of the stillness he'd found, the way a person went still when they'd stopped calculating and started standing in what was actually real. But the truth didn't undo the 12 minutes. Where's the off-site location? Storage unit in a commercial facility on the south side of Kildare. Bull rented it under the shell company's name. Unit 417. The facility is called Crestline Storage. Voss paused. I never saw it myself, but he told me about it when he showed me the ledger. Wanted me to understand that what was inside couldn't be retrieved or destroyed without him knowing. She was already on the phone to Casper before she reached the door. Casper. Crestline Storage, Kildare, Unit 417. I need federal presence there before Bull's vehicle arrives. He's going for a physical ledger. Full transaction records, the complete network. Do not let him reach that unit. Casper came back with 2 words. On it. She looked back at Voss from the doorway. He was standing in the middle of the room with his jacket open, and he looked like what he was. A man who had spent a long time being the largest presence in whatever room he occupied and had finally run out of room. MPs are coming in, she said. You're going to cooperate fully with whatever Prewitt needs, and you're not going to make any more calls. I understand. She left him with the MPs and went back down the stairs. Casper called back at 1347. They had Bull. Federal vehicles had reached Crestline Storage 11 minutes ahead of Bull's car, which had turned south off the highway toward Kildare's commercial district, exactly as the aerial had tracked. The passenger in the vehicle was a woman named Audra Seal, listed in Halvern Medical Supply's corporate filings as the company's operations manager. She had been carrying a laptop bag and a partial set of printed financial records, not the ledger itself, but secondary documentation that cross-referenced it in ways that would take investigators weeks to fully map. Bull had tried to reach the storage unit on foot after abandoning the vehicle 2 blocks from Crestline when he'd spotted the federal presence. A federal officer had picked him up in the parking lot of a laundromat across the street. He'd been carrying nothing. The vehicle had the financial records, the laptop, and Seal's phone, which had a contact list that would expand the investigation's reach significantly once it was processed. The ledger was in Unit 417, exactly where Voss had said it would be. Casper described it as a standard commercial binder, black cover, 3 rings, the kind sold in office supply stores that nobody looked at twice. Inside it were 143 pages of handwritten entries covering 37 months of transactions across 6 military medical facilities in the regional cluster. Names of coordinating officers, amounts per extraction, shell company routing codes, transfer dates, and a column on the right side of each entry that Casper described as disposition, where the money had gone, through which accounts, to which final destinations. 14 names appeared across the entries as coordinating contacts within the facilities. Voss was one of them. 2 of the others were officers Elena recognized from files at facilities she hadn't yet visited, which confirmed the pattern Casper had predicted and which made the scope of what was in that binder considerably larger than the Northbridge situation alone. How many facilities total? Elena asked. 6 confirmed, possibly 7. There are coded entries I can't decode without more context. We'll know more in 48 hours once the forensic accountants start on the financial routing. Casper's voice had the quality of a man who is doing the math and finding it large. This is bigger than a supply skimming operation, Vera. The amounts in this ledger, if the entries are accurate, we're talking about equipment valued at somewhere between $4 and $6 million over 3 years. Elena stood in the corridor outside Prewitt's anteroom and let that number sit in the air for a moment. $4 to $6 million in medical equipment across 6 facilities, extracted through a contractor network that had been built carefully enough to survive 14 months of operation before anyone with the right access had looked at the right shelves at the right time. The facilities that weren't on my assignment list, she said. Who's running their readiness evaluations? Regional Command is spinning up teams now. You started something this morning that's going to keep moving for a while. She knew that. She'd known it as early as the terminal room the night before, when the procurement pattern had expanded across 4 facilities, and she'd recognized it as a system rather than a local failure. Bull is in federal custody? Bull and Seal, both processed. Seal is cooperating already. She had corporate records on the laptop that she says demonstrate Bohl ran the operation without her full knowledge. Whether that's true or strategic, we'll find out. A pause. Bohl isn't talking. He will, Elena said. He kept that ledger as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. He's going to want to use it. That's our read too. Casper paused again. You should know. When we opened Unit 417, there was a second binder behind the ledger, smaller. Personal correspondence, printed emails, some photographs. One of them is a photograph of you. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. From when? She said. Dated 8 months ago. You're in civilian clothes outside what looks like a regional command building. Candid shot, long lens. His voice was careful. Bohl knew who you were before you arrived in Valderton. Elena processed this. 8 months ago, she'd been conducting a preliminary review at a different facility in the cluster. Not a full evaluation, just a preliminary assessment that had flagged some concerns without producing a formal finding. Someone at that facility had noticed her presence and had communicated it upward through Bohl's network. And Bohl had been watching her long enough to have a photograph, which meant the East Corridor camera going offline at EO 900 was not a maintenance issue. The camera, she said. East Wing, 3rd floor. I need to know who logged the maintenance request. She heard Casper moving, then a keyboard. Hold. 30 seconds. Logged at 0847 under a base maintenance contractor code. The contractor code belongs to... A pause with a different quality. Dale Decker. The name landed wrong. She stood with it for a moment, working through the sequence. Decker, who had come to her in the stairwell. Decker, who had given her the envelope with photographs and plate numbers. Decker, who had shown up exactly when the situation needed someone to show up, with exactly the right documentation, at exactly the right moment to appear to be a whistleblower seeking to unburden himself. Pull his full contractor history, she said. Everything from before Halvern, every base access log since he arrived at Northbridge 3 months ago. You think he's part of it? I think the camera going offline under his code at 0847 is the kind of thing that happens when someone needs a window that isn't being watched. She kept her voice even. And I think a man who spent 14 months driving for Bohl's operation and photographed the secondary pickups and kept the plates and came to me voluntarily in the middle of the night is either exactly what he presented himself as or the opposite of it, and I should have sat with that ambiguity longer than I did. Casper didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had the flat quality of someone reconfiguring their understanding of a situation. He gave a formal statement to Prewitt this morning. I know. If the statement is compromised, then we find out what's true in it and what isn't, and we adjust the record accordingly. She paused. Where is he now? Still in the anteroom, as far as I know. You told him to wait. Keep him there. Don't tell him anything about Bohl's arrest. Tell him there's a processing delay with the statement documentation. She was already moving toward the anteroom. And get me his full access log for the last 90 days by the time I get to the 2nd floor. She took the stairs at a pace that was not a run, but was close to one, because the shape of the morning had just shifted again, and she needed to understand the shift before it produced something she couldn't manage. Well, Decker was sitting in a chair against the wall of the anteroom when she walked in, and he had the patient look of a man who had been waiting and had made peace with waiting, which in retrospect she recognized as either genuine composure or practiced performance. She pulled a chair from the desk and sat across from him without the desk between them, because she wanted to watch his face without furniture mediating the distance. The East Wing camera, she said. 3rd floor. It went offline at 0847 this morning under your contractor maintenance code. Decker looked at her. He didn't move. I didn't log a maintenance request this morning. Your code was used. That doesn't mean I used it. A pause. My keycard access code is stored in the base maintenance system. It's accessible to anyone with admin privileges in that system. I've been in the anteroom since 0630. You know that. Elena watched him. He was right that the code alone wasn't evidence of his physical presence, and he was right that she knew his physical location from 0630 onward. Someone with system access could have used his code remotely to log the maintenance request without him being anywhere near a terminal. That was possible. It was also a very clean answer for a man who had just been confronted with an uncomfortable fact. Tell me about the photograph, she said. What photograph? Bohl had a photograph of me. Taken 8 months ago, long lens. outside a regional command building. She kept her voice conversational. You drove for Halvern during that period. You drove routes that passed through facilities in this cluster. Who at Halvern would have communicated my presence at that facility to Bohl? Decker's face was doing something she couldn't fully decode, which was itself a kind of information. Most people, when confronted with this kind of question from this angle, produced a legible reaction, confusion, or alarm, or the specific blankness of someone managing their response. Decker produced something in between, and in between was harder to read. I drove. I didn't report to Bohl directly. My contact was the dispatch coordinator, a woman named Pell. He paused. If Bohl wanted to know about something he'd seen flagged in his network, he'd go through Pell. I wouldn't have known about it. Did you know who I was when you approached me in the stairwell? The pause before this answer was 2 seconds shorter than she expected. No, I told you. I found out through the access flag on the identity query. Before that, you were just the woman in the coat who'd been counting shelves. And the photographs in the envelope, the plate numbers. I took them because the transfers felt wrong and I wanted documentation. I explained that. You explained it in a statement you gave to a JAG officer, which is now part of a formal record. She looked at him steadily. I need you to understand that if any part of that statement was constructed rather than accurate, the time to say so is before the federal investigation processes it, rather than after. Decker looked at his hands, then back at her. The photographs are real. The plates are real. The transfers happened the way I described them. He paused. I drove knowing the transfers weren't right, and I kept driving. That's in the statement, too. I didn't leave anything out. Why did you come to me when you did, in the stairwell, at that specific time? Because I heard the access flag discussion. I told you that. Heard it from whom? Decker was quiet for a moment. Robles, the supply tech. We know each other. She told me there was a high-clearance identity block on a query that had come from Voss's office, and she thought it meant someone important was actually paying attention this time. Elena filed this. Robles, who had cried in the supply corridor and then kept talking anyway, as the connection point. It was either a real answer or a carefully chosen one, and Robles could confirm or deny it in under 5 minutes. Stay here, Elena said, and stood. Am I a suspect? Decker asked. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was harder to identify. You're a witness whose statement is being verified, she said. That's a normal part of the process. She went to find Robles. Robles was on the afternoon shift prep in the supply room adjacent to the east wing, not the sealed corridor, but the secondary storage closer to the treatment wards. She was a small woman with efficient movements and the particular wary alertness of someone who had spent 2 years in a workplace that rewarded not noticing things. And she looked up when Elena came in with the expression of someone who had been half expecting this moment and was not entirely prepared for it anyway. Decker, Elena said, did you tell him about the identity access flag this morning? Robles blinked. Yes. I saw the alert come through the system around 0600 when I was prepping. I know Dale. We talked during a shift overlap last week. I texted him because he'd mentioned before that he wanted to find the right person to talk to about what he'd seen during his Halvern runs. She paused. Was that wrong? How did you know about his Halvern concerns? He told me a few weeks ago. We were both on an early prep shift and he was, I don't know, he seemed like he'd been carrying something for a long time. He said he'd done things he wasn't proud of and didn't know how to make them right without making everything worse for himself. Robles paused. I told him that wasn't my area of expertise, but I told him if someone important ever showed up asking the right questions, I'd let him know. Elena studied her. Robles had the face of someone telling a story that was true, including the parts that weren't entirely comfortable. Did anyone else know you were going to contact him? No, it was a text from my personal phone. Robles hesitated. Is he in trouble? I don't know yet, Elena said honestly, but you've been helpful. She went back to the anteroom. Decker was exactly where she'd left him, chair against the wall, hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing difficult arithmetic in his head. She sat back down across from him. Robles confirms the contact, she said. Her account matches yours. Something in Decker's posture released a fraction. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment that said the held breath had been let go. Okay. Your code being used on the camera log is still unexplained. I know. He paused. Someone wanted a window while Voss was in the anteroom with Prewitt. That means someone knew in advance that Voss was going to make a move during that window. Someone inside the process. Elena looked at him. He'd arrived at the same place she had, and he'd arrived there without apparent effort, which could mean he was smart, or it could mean he'd already been there and was walking her to the conclusion deliberately. She couldn't yet tell which. "We're going to verify your access logs for the past 90 days, she said. Physical terminal entries, keycard swipes, every time your code touched the system. If the camera log is the only anomaly, we'll know. Run it, he said. Please, I want you to run it. She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers back without blinking, and she could not fully determine, looking at him, whether she was looking at a man with nothing to hide or a man who had learned to perform nothing to hide with enough consistency that the distinction had become functionally invisible. Both possibilities were still open. She stood, and Prewitt came through the anteroom door at the same moment, and he had the expression of someone carrying a development he needed to deliver quickly. Voss made a statement addition, Prewitt said. He asked to go on record about the Decker situation. Elena went still. What about it? He says Bohl told him 3 months ago that there was a Halvern driver who had documentation of the secondary pickups, someone who'd photographed the transfers. Prewitt looked at her carefully. Bohl told Voss the driver was being managed, that the documentation was controlled, that the driver wasn't a liability because Bohl had leverage over him that would keep him from ever going to anyone with what he had. The anteroom was very quiet. Did Voss say what the leverage was? Elena asked. Yes. Prewitt glanced at the notepad in his hand. According to Voss, Bohl said the driver had signed receiving documents at 2 facilities that he knew were fraudulent. Documents that, if recovered, would make the driver appear to be a direct participant in the extraction scheme rather than a peripheral witness. He paused. Bohl told Voss the driver's name was Decker. Elena turned. Decker was still in his chair against the wall, and he was looking at her with an expression she finally knew how to read, because it was the expression of a man who had just watched the floor shift beneath him and was trying to decide in the seconds he had left which version of the next moment he was going to choose. The silence in the anteroom lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough for Elena to watch Decker work through whatever calculation he was running and arrive somewhere on the other side of it. He didn't bolt. He didn't perform surprise. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had reached a door he'd been walking toward for a long time and had finally stopped pretending he didn't know it was there. The receiving documents, he said. Bohl told me they were standard delivery confirmation forms. That's what I signed. He told you they were standard. Yes. Decker's voice was careful but not panicked, which was either innocence or very good control. I signed what I was handed. I didn't always read every line. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man who didn't ask enough questions. It sounds like a man who needed the work and told himself the questions weren't his job. He paused, which is different, but not by as much as I'd like. Elena looked at Prewitt. Pull the receiving documents from the federal seizure at Crestline, any that carry Decker's signature. Prewitt was already on his phone. She turned back to Decker. If the documents show you as a knowing participant, if the language goes beyond standard delivery confirmation into something that implies awareness of the secondary transfer scheme, your situation changes significantly from this morning. I know. And if the documents are standard confirmation forms that Bohl categorized as fraudulent after the fact to manufacture leverage over you, that also tells us something. She paused. Either way, I need you to stay in this room until we have the documents. Decker nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I was afraid of him, he said. Bohl. I knew something was wrong with those runs, and I didn't say anything because I was afraid of what he had on me, even before I knew exactly what he had. That's the part I'm not proud of. He stopped. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I think you should know the whole shape of it before you decide what to do with my statement. Elena looked at him for a moment. I was either the most consistently honest person she'd encountered in 5 days, or he was the most carefully constructed one, and she genuinely could not yet determine which. That uncertainty was itself data. It meant the question required more information rather than a decision based on what she currently held. The documents will tell us, she said. Sit tight. She went into the corridor and called Casper directly. The receiving documents arrived as scanned files 40 minutes later, transmitted from the Federal Processing Team at Crestline. There were 6 pages carrying Decker's signature across 4 separate delivery dates. Casper had already had his forensic document examiner run a preliminary assessment during transit. The assessment came back in 11 words: standard commercial delivery confirmation, no language indicating awareness of secondary transfer. Bohl had kept the documents because Decker's signature on a Halvern delivery confirmation, pulled out of context and presented alongside the false transfer records, would have looked incriminating enough to a non-specialist to serve as leverage. It was the same tactic he'd used with Voss: manufacture the appearance of complicity, then use the appearance to enforce silence. The difference was that with Voss, he'd had a real conversation to work from. With Decker, he'd had a signature on a form that said nothing more than a man had received boxes and counted them and let a truck driver take a load. Elena read the examiner's assessment twice. Then she went back into the anteroom. Decker looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. "The documents are standard confirmation forms," she said. "No language that indicates you knew what you were signing beyond what you described." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for longer than the 40 minutes she'd been in the corridor. It wasn't a dramatic release, just a slow, controlled exhale, the kind that came from someone who had been managing significant internal pressure and had finally been given permission to stop. "Okay," he said. Bohl's leverage was constructed. He took your signature on a standard form and stored it where it would look like something else if he ever needed it to. "That's what he does," Decker said quietly. "That's his whole method. He builds situations where everyone looks guilty enough to keep quiet." "It worked for 3 years across 6 facilities," Elena said. "Until it didn't." She told him his formal statement stood, that his cooperation had been genuine and would be reflected as such in the record, and that the federal investigation would require a follow-up interview in the coming weeks, but that his status as a voluntary witness with no criminal exposure had been confirmed. He thanked her in the quiet way of someone who didn't have a lot of elaborate language left, and she understood that too. She left him with Prewitt to finalize the statement addendum and went to find Ortega. Sergeant Ortega was in the East Supply Corridor, the original one, now unsealed but still under documentation protocol, standing with a clipboard and a careful expression, doing what he had apparently been doing in one form or another for the better part of a year, counting things that weren't adding up and trying to decide what to do about the gap. He looked up when Elena came in. "The physical inventory reconciliation team needs a point of contact within the facility," she said. "Someone who knows the actual count, the actual state of the storage systems, and who has been keeping accurate records regardless of what the official submission said." Ortega looked at her steadily. He had the face of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask him the right question for a very long time. "That would be me," he said. "I know. Can you start today?" "I started in March," he said. "I just didn't have anywhere to send the results." Something in Elena's chest did a small, uncomfortable thing. She'd been in this work long enough to know what that sentence cost a person. The years of accurate, careful, invisible labor done in the full knowledge that it was going nowhere, because the channels that were supposed to receive it had been captured by the people the labor was designed to hold accountable. The specific loneliness of being right in a system that had organized itself around a different answer. "You do now," she said. "I'll put your name in the reconciliation team's formal brief as the facility's primary contact. Everything you've documented goes into the record and gets attributed to you by name." Ortega nodded slowly. He wasn't performing humility. He just didn't have a lot of external ceremony around things, which she'd noticed from the first morning she'd spent with him counting shelves. "The 2 kits in the back," he said. "The ones I wasn't sure were serviceable." "What about them?" "I opened them yesterday. Both good." A pause. "So it's 114, not 112. Elena looked at him for a moment. He'd opened them and counted them on a day when the entire facility was in procedural chaos, because he was the kind of person who finished the count regardless of what was happening around him. 114, she said. Noted. She left him to his clipboard and went to write the preliminary recommendation. She worked for 3 hours in the conference suite, which had been cleared of its morning's participants and now held only her, a pot of coffee someone had left without being asked, and the accumulated documentation of 5 days in Valderton organized into a sequence that would travel up through the regional command structure and produce consequences that outlasted her time in this building by months or possibly years. The recommendation was 61 pages when she finished it. It named Merritt Bohl as the primary architect of a procurement fraud operation spanning 37 months and 6 military medical facilities, with estimated material losses between $4 and $6 million pending forensic accounting completion. It named Halvern Medical Supply as the vehicle, the shell company and Calder as the financial instrument, and Audra Sale as a knowing participant in the corporate structure. It named Colonel Adrian Voss as a coerced participant who had made progressively harmful choices to protect his initial exposure, recommended formal court-martial proceedings with full consideration of the coercive circumstances under which he'd first agreed, and noted that his cooperation in the final hours of the investigation, including the Crestline storage disclosure, had been material to the federal arrest. It named the 14 coordinating contacts across the 6 facilities by name, rank, and specific documented involvement. Each would face separate proceedings through their respective facility commands, coordinated through the regional JAG structure. It named Lunt, Colonel Deanna Price, as having co-signed documentation under sustained command pressure, having actively assisted the investigation during the critical overnight period, and having refused to provide credentials for the amendment attempt. It recommended a formal administrative review with full consideration of those mitigating factors, and noted that her 7 years of otherwise clean service at Northbridge had been conducted in conditions that were significantly more difficult than her evaluation history reflected. It named Sergeant Ortega, Medic Callahan, Supply Technician Robles, and 4 other staff members by name as having maintained accurate records and raised concerns through available channels, despite those channels being systematically unresponsive. It recommended formal commendations for each. It recommended Northbridge Military Medical Center for a supervised compliance rebuild under external oversight for a minimum of 12 months, with a specific protocol for restoring physical inventory to full readiness before any external inspection metrics were applied. It recommended an immediate expansion of the readiness evaluation program to all facilities sharing Halvern's contract history, with particular attention to facilities that had reported consistent inventory reconciliation adjustments in the previous 3 years. She read the whole thing once from the beginning, corrected 4 words, and submitted it through the secure regional channel at 1842. Then she sat in the empty conference suite with the pot of coffee and the window that looked out onto the parking structure, and she was quiet for a few minutes. Not thinking, exactly, just letting the day settle into its actual shape, which was different from the shape it had had at any point while she was inside it. Voss was formally charged the following morning. The proceedings were not loud, which was somehow worse than if they had been. The court-martial process had its own gravity and its own pace, and Voss moved through the initial proceedings with the face of a man who had stopped fighting the current and was letting it carry him, which was its own kind of statement about where he'd arrived. He entered the conference room at 0900 with Prewitt and a defense counsel the JAG office had assigned, and he sat down and answered every question with a directness he hadn't had in the room 2 days before. Elena was present as the investigating officer. She asked 3 questions total. Everything else was already in the record. When the session ended and Voss was escorted out, he paused in the doorway for a moment and turned back. Not to the room in general, to her specifically. He had the look of a man with something to say, and not enough language for it. "The morning you walked in wearing the uniform," he said, for a second I thought there was a way it wasn't what it looked like." "Was there?" Elena asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No, I just needed a second to accept that." He paused. "I want you to know that the nurses and medics here, they didn't know any of it. They were just doing the work." "I know that," she said. He nodded and went through the door. She watched it close. She had heard versions of that statement before, too. The 11th hour acknowledgement of the people the failure had been built on top of, the recognition that arrived only after there was nothing left to protect. It was genuine, probably. It just came about 2 years too late, which was the truest thing about it. Merritt Bohl was indicted on federal charges 17 days after his arrest at the Calder laundromat. The indictment covered procurement fraud, conspiracy, misappropriation of military resources, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Audra Sale had, as Casper had predicted, cooperated fully, and her cooperation had provided the financial routing documentation that connected Bowles Shell Company to 3 personal accounts and 1 offshore account that the forensic team had been working backward through the ledger to locate. The total value of misappropriated equipment across the 6 facilities came in at $5.3 million. The number was specific, and it was large, and it appeared in the regional command's formal announcement, which was released 41 days after Elena had arrived in Valderton in a plain gray coat. The announcement did not mention the coat. It named the investigation, the scope, the charges, and the outcomes. It listed the facilities that had been affected. It described the supervised rebuild program now underway at all 6 locations. It noted that several staff members had received formal commendations for maintaining accurate records and raising concerns through available channels. Ortega's name was in the announcement. So were Callahan's and Robles's. Elena had made sure of that when she'd reviewed the draft, because the announcement was a public document, and public documents had a way of becoming the version of events that persisted, and she'd wanted the version that persisted to include the names of the people who had done the right thing in conditions that made doing the right thing genuinely costly. Bowles' name was also in the announcement, with its accompanying charges. His photograph appeared in several regional news outlets the following day. He did not look the way people who had run a successful scheme for 3 years sometimes looked in photographs. He looked tired and reduced, and the laundromat parking lot had not been a dignified location for an arrest, which was not something Elena had planned but was not, she acknowledged privately, something she was sorry about. She left Valderton on a Wednesday, 43 days after she'd arrived. The morning she left, she had 2 conversations she hadn't scheduled. The first was with Felder, who had been placed on administrative hold pending the conclusion of the investigation into his role in the amendment request. His cooperation had been genuine and early, and the JAG review had concluded that his culpability, while real, was significantly mitigated by his voluntary disclosure and the risk he'd taken in coming to Elena at 0250 with information about the supply room repositioning. He would face a formal reprimand and a mandatory ethics review, which would affect his career in ways that were hard to fully predict. He was standing near the second-floor stairwell when she came through, and he stopped when he saw her. "I keep thinking about the amendment request," he said, "about how good it looked. Every word in the right place. And I've been trying to figure out when I learned to do that. Make wrong things look exactly right." He paused. "I don't think there was one moment. I think it was a lot of small moments where I told myself the adjustment was minor." Elena looked at him. "That's the honest version." "Yeah." He straightened slightly. "I don't know what I'm going to do next, career-wise, but I know what I'm not going to do." "That's a start," she said, and she meant it. The second conversation was with Price, who had received her formal administrative review result the previous afternoon. The review had concluded a letter of reprimand, mandatory compliance retraining, and a 1-year period of monitored command authority. Her service record would carry the reprimand, which meant the advancement she'd been passed over for twice would likely not come. She was standing in her office when Elena knocked, and she looked like a woman who had absorbed a significant blow and was still standing, which was not nothing. "I'm not going to tell you it's fair," Elena said. "I know it's not fair," Price said. "It's also not unfair. I signed. I made the choice every quarter for 18 months. She paused. "I've been trying to figure out which is worse, that I knew it was wrong, or that I got comfortable with knowing." "Both," Elena said. "But you didn't let him use your credentials that night, and you handed me a key card, and you didn't answer his calls. Those things are also in the record." "They don't erase the other things." "No, but they're part of who you are too." Elena paused. "The supervised rebuild is going to need experienced facility leadership for the next 12 months. Someone who understands where every gap was and why. Someone the staff will actually listen to." She looked at Price steadily. "That recommendation is also in the record." Price absorbed this. Her expression did the complicated thing it sometimes did, where several feelings were occupying the same space and none of them were winning. "You're not trying to make me feel better," Price said. "No. I'm describing the situation accurately." Something in Price's face settled. "All right." She paused. "Thank you. For, I'm not sure exactly what, for not making it cleaner than it was." "It was never going to be clean," Elena said. "It was always going to be what it was." She shook Price's hand, which was a formal thing that also wasn't entirely formal, and went to collect her bag. The bag was in the room she'd been reassigned to after the third-floor room became a procedural detail, and the gray coat was on the chair beside it. She picked up the coat and held it for a moment, looking at it. It was a plain field coat, military cut, no insignia, the kind that didn't attract attention in a building full of people who were too busy to look carefully. She'd been using versions of it for 4 years, at 6 different facilities. The coat was the same. The story it produced in the minds of the people who saw her wearing it was never quite the same twice, because people were not quite the same twice, and the particular flavor of invisibility it conferred depended on what each place was already trained to ignore. At Northbridge, it had produced a nurse who carried bags for colonels. At a facility in the Eastern Cluster 2 years ago, it had produced a contractor who nobody looked at twice. At a regional hospital the year before that, it had produced a logistics assessor whose questions were answered briefly and incompletely because the staff had places to be, and she didn't look important enough to give full answers to. The coat didn't make her invisible. It made her easy to underestimate, which was different, and the difference was the whole point. A knock at the door. She opened it. A young medic. She recognized him from the overnight rotation, a earnest-faced man named Vara, who had been covering double shifts during the staff shortage the supply chain failure had contributed to, was standing in the corridor with the look of someone who had decided to do something socially difficult and had committed to it. "I heard you were leaving this morning," he said. "I wanted to ask you something before you did." "Go ahead. The first time I saw you, you were in the supply corridor. You were just counting, writing things down. I thought you were an assessor of some kind, maybe compliance. I didn't think—" He stopped. I didn't look at you and see someone who was going to change anything. I'm sorry about that." Elena looked at him for a moment. He was genuinely apologetic, which meant he'd spent time thinking about his own assumptions, which was more than most people did. "You weren't wrong," she said. "I was counting. That's what I was doing." "But you were also counting," she said. "The counting is the work. The rank is just the room it happens in." She paused. "You've been working double shifts for 3 weeks to cover gaps that shouldn't exist." "Yeah. That's also the work. That's also someone counting in a building full of people who aren't looking." She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't apologize for not seeing the stars. The stars aren't the point. The work is the point." Vara nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else and then decided against it, which was the right call. He thanked her and went back down the corridor towards the ward, and Elena watched him go with the specific feeling she got when a conversation had landed somewhere real rather than somewhere comfortable. She put on the coat. She carried her own bag down to the car waiting outside, which was a base pool vehicle driven by a corporal who didn't know who she was and greeted her with professional courtesy, which was all that was required. The morning was cold in the particular way Valderton mornings were cold, the kind that came through the windows even when the windows were closed, the kind that made the air inside cars feel provisional. She looked out the window as the car moved through the base perimeter, the parking structure she'd watched from her window at 0300. The East Wing entrance where Voss had held out a travel case and expected someone to materialize around it. The main entrance with its functional lighting and its ordinary signage, and nothing about it from the outside that suggested what had been broken inside, or what was now, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant work still ahead of it, being put back together. There were no clean endings. She'd known that long enough for it to stop being a disappointment and become simply a condition of the work. Bull would go to trial, and the trial would take 18 months, and the outcome would be what the evidence and the lawyers and the process produced. And that process was real even when it was slow. Voss would face court-martial, and the result would weigh 2 years of harmful choices against 1 night of disclosed information and arrive somewhere in the middle, as results often did. Price would spend a year in monitored command authority and either rebuild something worth rebuilding or not, and that would depend on her in ways that had nothing to do with Elena. The 14 contacts across the 6 facilities would each face their own process and their own accounting, and some of those processes would be clean, and some would be contested, and some would take longer than anyone wanted, and produce outcomes that satisfied almost nobody completely. Ortega would keep counting. She was certain of that. He would count the kits as they came in and count them again when they were logged, and he would file accurate reports through channels that were now, for the first time in 2 years, actually responsive to what he filed. and he would do this without fanfare and without particular recognition beyond the formal commendation that would sit in his service record and matter to him in the private way that accurate records mattered to people who understood their value. Robles had already requested a transfer to the compliance oversight team that was being stood up under the supervised rebuild. Elena had seen the request in the administrative stack the previous afternoon and had flagged it for approval. Robles had spent 2 years doing invisible, necessary, accurate work in a system that had been organized around ignoring it, and she had the specific qualification that no training program produced. She knew exactly where the gaps were and why, because she'd been covering them by hand. Callahan would stay on the overnight rotation, probably. He had the particular orientation of people who worked nights, not because they had to, but because the work was different at night, and they preferred the version the night produced. Quieter, more direct, less mediated by the performance that daylight hours encouraged. He would continue to be exactly as good at his job as he had been before any of this, with the difference that the kits he needed would now, gradually and then consistently, actually be where they were supposed to be. That was the part that mattered most and was hardest to make visible in a report. Not the charges, not the indictment numbers, not the millions of dollars in misappropriated equipment recovered and cataloged and eventually returned to functioning inventory. The part that mattered most was a medic on the overnight rotation reaching for a trauma kit and finding one. The part that mattered most was Ortega filing a discrepancy notice and having it go somewhere real. The part that mattered most was a supply technician flagging a problem and being answered by something other than a reclassification and a silence. That was what a system looked like when it worked. Not smooth, not perfect, full of people who were imperfect and tired and sometimes scared and sometimes making the wrong call and sometimes doing the right thing for the wrong reason and sometimes doing the right thing for the right reason and getting no particular recognition for it. Just functional, just honest about its own state. Just correctable when it failed, which it would, because systems failed and the question was never whether they would fail, but whether the failure could be seen and named and addressed before the cost of it landed on someone who couldn't absorb it. The car reached the base perimeter gate and paused for clearance and then moved through, and Valderton proper spread out ahead of them. The gray industrial corridor, the older streets, the city that had spent 2 decades pretending its best years weren't behind it, and which, from the window of a passing car, looked exactly like a city trying to figure out what came next. Elena's phone buzzed. Casper. She answered. Vera. Federal preliminary hearing is set for the 14th, he said. Bowles' defense is going to challenge the Crestline warrant on procedural grounds. They'll lose that challenge. The warrant was clean. I know. I just wanted you to know it's going to take the shape it's going to take. It always does. She paused. What's your read on the timeline? Trial in 14 months if the challenge fails quickly. Longer if it doesn't. A pause. Seal's cooperation has been exceptional. She's given us 3 additional contacts in the contractor network we didn't have from the ledger alone. Bowl built it wide, Elena said. Wide networks have a lot of seams. Yeah, turns out they do. Casper paused one more time. Good work, Vera. For what it's worth from where I sit. She looked out the window at the city passing by. It's worth something, she said, and meant it without overstating it, and ended the call. The driver asked her something about the airport route, and she answered, and the conversation was brief and functional and completely ordinary, and she settled back into the seat with the gray coat over her lap, and the authorization document still in the inside pocket, and the recorder still in the left pocket, because the recorder went everywhere until she was home, and the files were transferred to the secure archive, and the device was cleared. She thought about what Vara had said in the corridor. I didn't look at you and see someone who was going to change anything. And she thought about the honest answer to that, which was more complicated than what she'd given him, and which she carried with her the way she carried most things, quietly, without much ceremony, in a pocket nobody could see. The honest answer was that she hadn't known what she was going to find in Valderton when she'd landed. She'd known there was a predicate concern, a pattern in the data, a discrepancy large enough to flag. She hadn't known about Bowles' network or the physical ledger or the transit point outside the city or the photograph of herself in a contact's possession or the 14 names across 6 facilities. She hadn't known about Ortega counting shelves for 8 months with nowhere to send the results, or Robles texting a driver she trusted in the early morning, or Felder sitting with a drafted amendment request and looking at the words he'd put in exactly the right order and not being able to make himself send it. She hadn't known any of it until she walked in with no stars showing and started counting things. That was the actual work, not the authority. She'd had that before she got off the plane. Not the documentation. That was the record of the work, not the work itself. The work was the walking, and the counting, and the listening, and the sitting in a cold terminal room at midnight, understanding that the gap between the paper and the shelf was not a clerical error, but a choice that someone had made and sustained and required other people to sustain alongside them. The work was being the person who kept counting when the numbers didn't match. Stars showed people what they were supposed to respect. She'd told a young medic that from a doorway, and she'd meant it, and she still meant it, and she also knew that the full version of it was harder to say in a doorway. The full version was that she'd spent 30 years learning what people respected when they thought nobody important was watching, and what she'd found, in facility after facility, in corridor after corridor, was that the people doing the actual work, the overnight rotations, and the supply clerks and the medics improvising solutions to problems that should have been solved above them. Those people kept doing the work regardless of who was watching. They kept counting. She never stopped being grateful for that. For the Ortegas of every facility she'd ever walked through, filing accurate reports into systems that ignored them, maintaining the true number in the face of a documented lie, doing the invisible work because the invisible work was what the whole structure stood on, whether the structure acknowledged it or not. The car pulled onto the highway heading east, and Valderton fell behind, and the gray morning opened up ahead of them, and Elena Vera sat with the coat on her lap and looked at the road and thought about the next facility on the assignment list, which was 3 weeks from now, and what she would wear when she walked through the door. She already knew.